Welcome viewers to IOM Ethiopia's panel discussion today on International Migrants Day 2020. I'm Sharif Faisal, Project Development and Policy Officer with IOM in Ethiopia, and I will be facilitating our discussion today. The year 2020 will forever be associated with COVID-19. It has been a challenging year for everyone, and particularly challenging for people on the move. Human mobility is a key component of social and economic landscapes. The decisions made today with respect to human mobility will impact societies and people's economic lives for years to come. The Global Compact for Migration, widely known as GCM in short, represents an opportunity to reimagine safe, orderly, and dignified migration for the benefit of all. That is why the theme of this year's International Migrants Day is Reimagining Human Mobility. The GCM is an effective tool for nation-states to discuss how best to address challenges to human mobility posed by crises like this COVID-19 that we are facing, without having to compromise the sovereignty of states and human rights of people. Viewers, before we go deeper in our discussion on reimagining human mobility, let us hear from IOM's Director General, Antonio Vitorino.
Last year, on International Migrants Day, we highlighted the importance of social cohesion and recognized the generosity of society supporting migrants in their communities, unaware of what 2020 would bring. We declared migrants to be champions of resilience when times are tough, unaware of how they and we will be put to the test. This year, we have all witnessed firsthand the critical role migrants have played in our societies on the front lines of our fight against COVID-19, caring for the sick, working to maintain essential services. The dedication and entrepreneurial spirit we have seen this year reminds us that as we move from pandemic response to recovery, over the coming months, migrants will be an integral part of that return to normal life. But for this to happen, we must reinforce the efforts already made by many countries to ensure migrants are fully included in our COVID-19 responses, including access to social services and ensuring they do not get left behind. Many migrants have found themselves reduced to poverty, the first to be let go and the last to be rehired. Economically disadvantaged, many have become stranded, unable to return home, while still more have been forced to return without due regard for their safety. At the extremes, migrants may be prey to the criminals who would exploit their vulnerability for profit. Human rights are not learned by virtue of being a hero or a victim, but are an entitlement of everyone, regardless of origin, age, gender, and status. But support and protection are needed if migrants are to contribute fully to their and also to our recovery. As vaccines become available, migrants, regardless of their status, must be ensured equitable access to national programming, not as a special class of people, but as friends, neighbors, and co-workers. The global response to COVID-19 presents a unique opportunity to reimagine human mobility from the ground up, to implement the vision of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and build prosperous, healthy, and resilient communities. We together can make it happen.
Joining us on the panel today for discussing reimagining human mobility are Ms. Pumza Mankindi, Head of IOM Liaison to the African Union, Mr. Malambo Munga, IOM's Migration Management Program Coordinator in Ethiopia, Ms. Mariki Helena Ripola, Humanitarian Child Protection Officer with the UNICEF Liaison Office to the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Now we are going to hear from our panel members on the opportunities that GCM present in their areas of work.
Thank you very much for that important question. Very timely too, considering the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think if there's one thing that we have learned sadly through this pandemic is that we are all in it together. The international community absolutely has to cooperate to solve these major transboundary issues. And what better opportunity to do so when we have a framework in place, such as the Global Compact for Migration, that provides the first ever international consensus on how to govern migration, but also provides practical tools and actions for member states to implement in their own countries according to their own capacities and priorities. In terms of opportunities for Ethiopia, those have been plentiful. So for the first time ever, the GCM facilitated a gathering of national stakeholders from across all spheres of society in Ethiopia to discuss about migration and agree on how Ethiopia wants to manage migration, both in terms of the challenges associated with it, but also the opportunities that can be derived from well-governed migration. We've also seen, since the adoption of the GCM, the government of Ethiopia rallying different sectors of government to develop the necessary policy and legislative frameworks needed to facilitate the whole of government approach required to fully implement the GCM and realize its objectives. And subsequent to the development of these policies and regulations, we've seen very concrete actions implemented both by government, but also by the UN system and civil society in a way that for the first time, I think, represents a coherent approach towards managing migration-related challenges and maximizing opportunities for Ethiopia.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I think in my line of work, working with the African Union Commission and its building blocks, which are the regional economic communities, and of course, the member states, I think it becomes important to understand the origins of the GCM and indeed the context in which it was negotiated. With the origins of the GCM, I think two very important activities or events that created the impetus of the GCM are needed to be highlighted. Those would be the high-level summit on migrants and refugees that took place before the negotiation of the GCM. And these summits actually happened in the context of a time where there was a crisis, a perceived crisis of large movements of people from the global south to Europe, as it were. And this perceived crisis, as it were, was not necessarily translated into the GCM, because if you can look at the GCM and how it was negotiated, the GCM is kind of underpinned in the principle of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, which means that the GCM is linked to development. Absolutely. Which is very important. And if we talk about the context in which the GCM was negotiated, it was happening in a time where there was a lot of nationalism that was taking place and a lot of xenophobia, that was rampant in the world. And at a time where there was a decline in political willingness and multilateralism. So the fact that the GCM was successfully negotiated, and even agreed to by over 152 member states is a great achievement. Absolutely. That should not be taken very lightly. So the GCM is really, really an important framework that brings relevant parties to the table to negotiate and talk about how migration can be governed for the benefit of all. But I think for the discussion of today, an important point to highlight is that the GCM resolution outlines 10 categories of stakeholders. This includes civil society, private sector, parliamentarians, among them, but more importantly, migrants themselves. And this is very important that migrants, these are the migrants who come to countries of destination and bring their skill and labor. But at the same time, they send remittances back home and send investments back home.
Absolutely.
And these are at the core of migration. And GCM brings them to the table to discuss how migration can benefit all. I know that some people may look at the GCM as an agreement that makes migrants subjects of the agreement instead of parties to the agreement, as GCM is state-led. But of course, all of us, understand that migration is fundamentally a governance issue. Of course, this is a discussion for another day. But I think the point that I wanted to make today is that this is an important framework that ensures that relevant stakeholders are brought to the table to discuss migration and ensure that it works for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Now we'd like to hear from our panel members on their thoughts on how COVID-19 affected the way societies talk about migrants.
The pandemic has hit children and youth particularly hard, and we are even
talking about an unprecedented global child rights crisis. As we look to 2021, the stakes could not be higher for children and young people on the move, who make up to 51% of the world's international migrants. So they are among the ones who have the most to gain from our joint actions and the most to lose from our inaction as well. Yet, under the pretext of protecting public health and effectively responding to COVID-19, many governments are ignoring some of the basic commitments under international law. They're closing the borders while making no exceptions for those seeking international protection or family reunification. They're suspending asylum and immigration procedures in law or practice and denying access to their territories to migrants and displaced people. Also preventing those rescued at sea from disembarking at the ports, as well as pushing back and forcibly returning unaccompanied and separated children. In addition to this, xenophobia, racism and discrimination have skyrocketed. So in the public discussions, they have taken a very negative turn when it comes to migrants and refugees and IDPs and stateless persons this year. These people are seen currently as security threats and as very agents of the virus. So indeed, the language has hardened this year, and we're saddened to see this. But at the same time, the pandemic has presented us an opportunity to reimagine human mobility, as you were pointing out. So first of all, the pandemic has shown us very clearly that exclusion is costly and inclusion pays off. So we need inclusive public health and socioeconomic responses to the virus. And secondly, we have come to realize that no one is safe until everybody is safe. Diagnostics, treatment, and most importantly, of course, vaccine must be made accessible to all. And lastly, as the Secretary General has pointed out as well, people on the move are part of the solution. So therefore, we must ensure that there are safe pathways for migrants and migration to happen in a regular way. And remittances must be able to be sent without huge transaction costs. And in general, we must ensure that we don't let the barriers and border closures that had to be implemented during the pandemic to stay longer than necessary, but we remove those in a safe and timely manner to enable free movement. As we have seen, no country can fight the pandemic alone, and nor can we fight or address migration. But together we can address both, please.
Wow, COVID-19. I think COVID-19 has been a litmus test for the GCM itself, but mostly for all nations actually, for the socio-economic and political institutions of nations. It has exposed weaknesses, vulnerabilities. Even the most developed nations have been exposed, But I think for for migrants, I mean, with all the unfortunate or atrocities that we've seen during the pandemic, in that there's been so many stranded migrants in different places. But I think we have seen the need for migrants who have come out as essential workers. It has kind of brought the spotlight on the need for migrants in developing nations as essential workers. And for that, we can continue to see the relevance, and moving forward, how important migration will continue to be for the economies of these nations, for the economies of developing and developed nations moving forward. And of course, for the sustainable development agenda moving forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, to complement what Punza has said, unfortunately, the pandemic has once again reminded the global community that when we leave people behind, the crisis affects us all. And what the COVID pandemic has demonstrated is that those who are already in situations of vulnerability, so those that don't have access to healthcare, to basic services, to protection services, to information, are the ones who will be most affected when crises such as that brought about by the COVID pandemic hit. And the unfortunate thing about the pandemic is that we cannot isolate one group of people and not provide them support. If we are to get out of this as a global community, we have to make sure that no one is left behind. Unfortunate as that has been, I think it's been a valuable lesson for us to carry forward, as we move in the last decade of the Agenda 2030 agenda, where we need to make sure that there are concerted efforts across the board, across all spheres of development, humanitarian response, to absolutely make sure that people that need support are included in our responses. But also, I think, as noted by the UN Secretary General, the pandemic has also given us an opportunity to reimagine how migration can be governed moving forward. So the GCMs got us started on this road, when the international community rallied for the very first time, agreed on the compact and its principles and objectives and associated actions. This joint accountability process began then. But I think what the pandemic has also demonstrated in countries like Ethiopia is that we need to effectively mobilize all the resources we have available to respond to the needs, but we also need to effectively integrate migrants and other people in vulnerability into our recovery plans. So Ethiopia, as UN country team, has developed a quite robust, comprehensive socioeconomic recovery plan for COVID. And in it, migrants are considered as populations that need due attention, but also as a resource for the long-term recovery. You mentioned earlier remittances and how those continue to be extremely important for access to healthcare, education, basic services for households and families in Ethiopia, despite the COVID pandemic. So I think there's been a mix of both challenges heightened in the face of the pandemic, but also opportunities for us to do things better, to be reminded of the importance of inclusion and leaving no one behind in the development and humanitarian work that we do.
Ms. Punza, this pandemic has given rise to a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Please share with us some key facts and figures, evidence-based if you will, that refutes common misconception about migrants from Africa.
A lot of misconception is out there about migration and African migration. And in fact, this is the reason why the African Union Commission, together with IOM, have put together a joint publication that seeks to deconstruct this misinformation. This inaugural report, the African Migration Report, is titled Challenging the Narrative. And indeed, we want to deconstruct these myths and indeed debunk them. And the hope of IM and the African Union Commission is that this report will promote migration as an academic discipline in institutions of higher learning, thereby generating knowledge that will inform policy making on the African continent. Coming to the facts about African migration on the continent. Number one, most African migrants do not cross seas. They cross land borders. Two, 94% of African migrants who actually do cross seas do so through regular channels. And by regular channels, we mean that they will be in possession of valid travel documents and they will have obtained visas, etc. Three, Africa accounts for 14% of the global migrant population. Now, this is compared to 24%, which is Europe, 41%, which is Asia. Now, you can do the math yourself. In 2019, the Africa Migration Report indicates that 7.3 million refugees and asylum seekers were on the African continent. And now this is 25% of the global refugee and asylum seeker population on the planet. So you can see that there's a very large population of refugees and asylum seekers that are being hosted here on the continent, that is Africa. So the whole idea and misconception or these myths about most African migrants moving or seemingly moving from the south to the global north, as it were, is really this perceived misconception that the Africa Migration Report wants to debunk. And this inaugural report has a lot of many other statistics that have been put together to ensure that all these myths are being debunked. The Africa Migration Report is a 16-chapter report that looks at various thematic areas. And the 16th chapter actually looks at scenarios that look at how Africa migration would be in the future, a positive outlook of migration on the continent. It is a very good report that I would challenge you to look at and should be used at institutions of higher learning as a report that should be referenced. And as I said, it's a report that we want to use to generate knowledge on the continent, but more importantly, to be used as a reference for evidence-based and developing policy on the continent. Thank you.
Mr. Malambo, the COVID-19 pandemic brought us a scenario rarely imagined before: closed borders, many for a very long time, even until now. How does the GCM help in addressing these unprecedented challenges brought by COVID-19? What is the specific added value we can borrow from the GCM for effectively addressing these unique challenges? And finally, what is the ultimate scope that the governments and international organizations should focus on when addressing these challenges?
Let me start with the last part of that question, because I think it best exemplifies the opportunity that the GCM brings. So the scope is pretty much limitless. The scope is limitless in the sense that with the right political will and the right investments to back up that political will, it is absolutely possible to manage migration for the benefit of all. In the context of the COVID pandemic, what that means is, first of all, ensuring that migrants are included in all COVID-19 health and socioeconomic responses, including positioning migrants at the center of the solutions as frontline workers, as manufacturers, as service providers, as skilled professionals, entrepreneurs, etc. Migrants have to be central to the solutions. If you look at the objectives of the GCM, the commitments that member states bind themselves to, you will very quickly realize that there are a lot of actions that can guide lasting solutions to the COVID pandemic. For instance, the GCM commits member states to make access to basic services and healthcare a priority for all migrants, irrespective of their status. And that last part is very important because most often than not, migrants are excluded from accessing basic services and protection services simply because they are irregular migrants. That should not be the case. Immigration status should not be the reason to not provide basic services to migrants and ensure that their human rights are well respected. The second part that the GCM facilitates is, again, reminding us all of this shared commitment we have as an international community on managing migration for the benefit of all. What is unique about the GCM is that I think it provides a recognition for the first time among member states that while governments and state actors are at the center of migration governance, nonetheless, governments cannot do this alone. There are many other non-state actors that need to be brought to the table, that need to contribute their ideas and their resources, as well as their mandates to ensure that we all come out of this stronger as an international community. So the principle of a whole of society approach to the governance of migration as provided in the GCM is absolutely critical, especially at a time like this where we need all sectors of society to rally together and address this common challenge. Finally, the COVID pandemic has also ensured that we innovate as countries and as governments. We innovate our diplomacy and our cooperation. We innovate the way we provide healthcare. We innovate the way we provide humanitarian assistance, because business as usual has failed to effectively respond to a pandemic of this nature. And if we were to learn from this as an international community and as individual countries, we have to make sure that one of the lessons we carry forward is the importance of innovation in all spheres of policy, technology, service delivery, but also the understanding of migrants and migration to ensure that we successfully recover both socially and economically from the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
With over 900,000 registered refugees and asylum seekers residing in the country, Ethiopia is the second largest refugee hosting country in Africa. So my question to our distinguished panel members is that, in your opinion, how best can we fight xenophobia in contexts such as this?
Xenophobia, general discrimination and racism has been something that has unfortunately been skyrocketing throughout the pandemic, and it's something that we must commonly address. And a lot of the fears that are, of course, behind xenophobia and discrimination stem from perhaps false information and false or fake news as well. So we need to be very careful to address these and have the actual and proper and timely data and information. And of course, it's not enough that we have this, but we have to also make sure that this information is accessible and it's public and it's there so that people have the real-time information, and these sort of distorted news won't take the presence and dominate the overall atmosphere.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panel members for their wonderful insights on reimagining human mobility and taking the time to join us today. Dear viewers, we have with us today UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator in Ethiopia, Dr. Catherine Sozi, to share her thoughts on the International Migrants Day and reimagining human mobility.
On International Migrants Day, we recognize the contributions and celebrate the vitality of the world's 272 million migrants. This year's theme for International Migrants Day, Reimagining Human Mobility, has never been timelier. 2020 has been a challenging year for everyone, particularly for people on the move. COVID-19 has presented critical challenges for humans everywhere. Restrictions on human mobility are exposing many people on the move to significant risks, impacting their human rights and well-being, impeding our collective response to the pandemic, and threatening our ability to ensure a recovery in which no one is left behind. But this current environment is also an opportunity for us to reimagine how migration can be governed in a more humane and effective way during and after this crisis. Migration has always been with us. Like many of us, I'm one of the 272 million migrants in the world today. Some of us move out of choice, and when out of choice, migration can compel economic growth, reduce inequalities, and connect diverse societies. Yet others migrate because they do not have a choice. Indeed, since ancient times, people have moved in search of better lives. Climate change, demographics, instability, growing inequalities, and aspirations for a better life, as well as unmet needs in labor markets, mean it is here to stay. I thank our colleagues for sharing their insightful thoughts during today's panel discussion, and IOM in Ethiopia specifically for bringing us together to commemorate this important day. I'd like to end today's online gathering by highlighting just 3 key messages. Firstly, we need effective international cooperation in managing migration to ensure that its benefits are most widely distributed and that human rights of all concerned are properly protected, as recognized by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Global Compact for Migration represents an opportunity to jointly reimagine safe, orderly, and dignified migration for the benefit of all. Secondly, echoing what the IOM Director General Antonio Vitorino said earlier, as we move towards the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, we need to remind ourselves that the exclusion of people on the move is the same reason they are amongst the most vulnerable to this pandemic today. Inclusion will pay off and is the only way that we can emerge from this crisis and overcome COVID-19. And finally, that even in difficult times like these, migrants continue to provide essential services and must be acknowledged and celebrated for their vital contribution to societies. Thank you and happy International Migrants Day to all.
To those watching, we kindly request you to take time to recognize the migrants you know, acknowledge their resilience in the face of COVID-19, appreciate their contributions fighting the pandemic, and together, let us reimagine the future of mobility, building back a more fair, more inclusive world. To all the migrants in the world, we recognize you today and every day. Thank you very much.